Reality
Check.
Podcast.
It's time now for the second part of our series on the military carbon bootprint of armies and armed conflict. We heard yesterday that there's a lack of transparency on the greenhouse emissions caused by armies, but there's also a growing awareness of the need to address this issue. The Conflict and Environment Observatory in the UK is one of the handful of groups trying to increase our understanding of the environmental consequences of military activities. Researcher Owen Derbyshire told Joanna Bostock about some of their findings.
So just to use the example of aircraft, we found this staggering statistic. I couldn't quite believe it, but the number of military aircraft is about double the number of civilian commercial aircraft. So if you can imagine all the resources which are required to build all the kind of civilian planes that we use to fly across the world and then double it, that's just the military's emissions for just aircraft alone.
Of course, and then we've got things like tanks and helicopters and guns.
Absolutely. And it's the complexity, but also just the scale. It is all of these things, and you've got to understand the provenance of all of these things and the contributing factors. And it's a lot of it's basically hidden, a lot of that information. So it's really difficult for researchers to actually get a handle on what it could be, what these numbers actually would be.
And is there sort of perhaps a growing awareness of the fact that this is an issue that needs to be addressed?
Certainly in the last 12 months, it does seem that there's a lot more attention on it than there was. There's now a few different civil society organisations like ourselves kind of trying to start a dialogue about it. There's been some media reports off the back of it. And just trying to get people aware. And in part, there are now statements being made by militaries about their carbon emissions.
You talked about the hardware and the supply chains and everything. What about an army which isn't actually engaging in active combat? They still exist as an army. So how much of that is still producing greenhouse gas emissions? I'm thinking of things like training exercises.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic point. So the estimated land surface covered by military training lands is somewhere between 1% and 6% of the whole global land surface. Even if it's 1%, that's huge. And if you imagine the vegetation on that land, how that's kind of used and managed could have a really significant bearing on emissions. You know, what grows there versus what could grow there. Quite often these training camps don't have any trees. It's all kind of grassland, so they can have lines of sight and things like that. Quite often on these training lands, there's accidental wildfires as ammunition sets them off. There's also soil degradation from training exercises churning up the land. And then on top of that, there's the issue of housing these soldiers, feeding them, transporting them around. You know, there's going to be really significant emissions there altogether. But again, I just can't provide any clarity on what the actual number might be there, or what even scale we're talking. It's just so chronically under-researched.
That was Owen Derbyshire from the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Tomorrow we'll hear about some of the direct and indirect ways armed conflict contributes to climate change.
FM4 Reality Check.
Two leading opposition figures in Belarus were jailed yesterday. Maria Kolesnikova, who helped organise protests against President Lukashenko last year, was given a sentence of 11 years, while her associate, lawyer Maxim Sinak, received 10 years. Amnesty International said the sentences were intended by the authorities to crush the hopes of Belarusians who aspire to peaceful change and respect of human rights. Our Moscow correspondent Charles Mains told Steve Crilly why Maria Kolesnikova is so prominent.
Maria Kolesnikova is 39 years old. She's a former professional flutist, so she played in orchestras in Belarus, in Europe, in Germany, other places. And she got involved in politics, and she was involved in the presidential campaign of Alexander Lukashenko's rivals, a man named Babariko, who was subsequently arrested and jailed for trying to participate in the elections. And she emerged as one of a trio of women along with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who basically became the face of the protest movement against Lukashenko last summer. Now, what's interesting about Kolesnikova is that while the others have essentially all fled, members of the opposition have all fled abroad to Europe under pressure, of course, from the Belarusian state, Kolesnikova stayed. The Belarusian authorities tried to deport her. They put a bag over her head and basically sent her to the border. And rather than go across into Europe, she ripped up her passport, came back, and she's been in jail ever since.
And along with Maxim Znak, they were subjected to a closed trial.
Right. I mean, the Belarusian state's argument here, this is, of course, Lukashenko and his goons are saying that they were trying to overthrow the government, that these were threats to the state. We hear from both Maxim's and Kolesnikova's lawyers who say, look, there was no evidence presented at all. This is just about trying to intimidate the opposition movement in Belarus. And of course, Mr. Lukashenko, it must be said, after having hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets over the past year, he's held on. And that's really thanks to a crackdown by police, over 30,000 people arrested, and support from Moscow. President Vladimir Putin here came to Lukashenko's rescue. He's providing essentially security support and just backing and money to keep Lukashenko in power.
And protesting anywhere across Belarus today is nigh impossible, I'd imagine. Too dangerous.
It's become very, very dangerous. And we see that time and again. And so in a sense, you have kind of a shadow state that's gone into Europe. This is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who many think was the actual winner of last year's presidential race. Her husband was a would-be candidate, also now is in jail. So we see there's sort of two paths for people that are opponents of Mr. Lukashenko. They're either in jail in Belarus or they fled abroad to Europe.
That was our correspondent Charles Main. Steve Crilly was asking the questions.
FM4 Reality Check.
The conversation in Auf Laut this evening is all about vaccination. What motivates people to get vaccinated or not? And the pros and cons of mandatory vaccination. Sociologists and public health researchers have put a lot of effort into understanding how people can be persuaded rather than forced to accept vaccines and other medical measures that prevent illness. They have found that the real influencers are not celebrities on Instagram, but more ordinary people within a social network or community. Joanna Bostock spoke to Damon Centola, who's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania.
We do this all the time in public health. We do it with initiatives for every kind of public health problem, from, HIV to MMR vaccines. And people are doing it again now with COVID vaccines. And so we already have techniques for reaching out to people and inviting them to be part of a campaign and inviting them to message, on behalf of the decisions they make, either on social media or more publicly. The real question is, okay, well, who do we get to do that? And that is really the question that we're answering in a new way.
I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that you say that the mechanisms already exist. So that would be starting something within a particular community and making sure a conversation starts within that community?
It's making sure a conversation starts, but it's more importantly incentivizing people to adopt a new preventative strategy. And you've got to think about the vaccination question around COVID as part of just, the entire scope of preventive medicine. There's always a strategy we can adopt that will help to, stem the further spread of a disease. And it's a similar kind of question with vaccination, which is, okay, we have this vaccine we can give to people and it'll prevent disease transmission. How do we get people to actually take it? Then all of a sudden you have to deal with the people's beliefs about what the possible side effects are, what the possible implications are, the possible dangers are. So very quickly, something that starts out as kind of a scientific medical question turns into a social question. And you saw this even earlier on before we had a vaccine. You saw the same thing with face masks. And so the question is, well, how do we then grow greater acceptance of these preventive strategies across different communities?
And you said, sort of the next question, or one of the big questions, is who do you reach out to start this? Where do you find the people to be the influencers?
So one of the things that we have now today that we haven't had historically is really good social network data. Public health officials and also scientists have collected very, detailed and robust friendship data or household neighbor data and interaction data among people within the workplace and so forth. And so we can also make inferences about if you were to initiate a vaccine acceptance campaign within these sort of households in this community, how effective would that be at growing acceptance, throughout the broader neighborhood that they're in, and then spreading it to other parts of the neighborhood across, bridges to different social groups. And so we can find those people and those households and then, use our same old targeting strategies to incentivize them to show their vaccination decisions and to sort of make a more public demonstration of their choices in a way that will generate a kind of social cascade through that part of the network, which will then spread through the rest of the network as well.
That was Damon Centola, who was also the author of Change: How to Make Big Things Happen.
Reality
Check.
Podcast.